Chapter 3, Part 3 of Apologia Pro Vita Sua, by John Henry Cardinal Newman. Instead then of speaking of errors in doctrine, I was driven by my state of mind to insist upon the political conduct, the controversial bearing, and the social methods and manifestations of Rome. And here I found a matter ready to my hand, which affected me the more sensibly for the reason that it lay at our very doors. I can hardly describe too strongly my feeling upon it. I had an unspeakable aversion to the policy and acts of Mr. O'Connell, because, as I thought, he associated himself with men of all religions and no religion against the Anglican Church, and advanced Catholicism by violence and intrigue. When then I found him taken up by the English Catholics, and, I suppose, at Rome, I considered I had a fulfilment before my eyes, how the Court of Rome played fast and loose, and justified the serious charges which I had seen put down in books against it. Here we saw what Rome was in action, whatever she might be when quiescent. Her conduct was simply secular and political. This feeling led me into the excesses of being very rude to that zealous and most charitable man, Mr. Spencer, when he came to Oxford in January 1840 to get Anglicans to set about praying for unity. I myself at the time, or soon after, drew up such prayers. Their desirableness was one of the first thoughts which came upon me after my shock. But I was too much annoyed with the political action of the Catholic body in these islands to wish to have anything to do with them personally. So glad in my heart was I to see him, when he came to my room with Mr. Palmer of Magdalen, that I could have laughed for joy. I think I did laugh, but I was very rude to him. I would not meet him at dinner, and that, though I did not say so, because I considered him in loco apostate from the Anglican Church, and I hereby beg his pardon for it. I wrote afterwards with a view to apologize, but I dare say he must have thought that I made the matter worse, for these were my words to him: "The news that you are praying for us is most touching, and raises a variety of indescribable emotions. May their prayers return abundantly into their own bosoms. Why then do I not meet you in a manner comfortable with these first feelings? For this single reason, if I may say it, that your acts are contrary to your words. You invite us to a union of hearts, at the same time that you are doing all you can, not to restore, not to reform, not to reunite, but to destroy our Church. You go further than your principles require. You are leagued with our enemies. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. This is what especially distresses us. This is what we cannot understand, how Christians, like yourselves, with the clear view you have that a warfare is ever waging in the world between good and evil, should, in the present state of England, ally yourself with the side of evil against the side of good. Of parties now in the country, you cannot but allow that next to yourselves we are nearest to revealed truth. We maintain great and holy principles, we profess Catholic doctrine. So near are we as a body to yourselves in modes of thinking, as even to have been taunted with the nicknames which belongs to you. And on the other hand, if there are professed infidels, scoffers, skeptics, unprincipled men, rebels, they are found among our opponents. And yet you take part with them against us. You consent to act hand in hand with these and others for our overthrow. Alas, all this it is that impresses us irresistibly with the notion that you are a political, not a religious party, that in order to gain an end on which you set your hearts, an open stage for yourselves in England, you ally yourselves with those who hold nothing against those who hold something. This is what distresses my own mind so greatly. To speak of myself, that, with limitations which need not now be mentioned, I cannot meet familiarly with leading persons in the Roman communion, and least of all when they come on a religious errand. Break off, I would say, with Mr. O'Connell in Ireland, and the Liberal parties in England, or come not to us with overtures for mutual prayer and religious sympathy." And here came in another feeling of a personal nature, which had little to do with the argument against Rome, except that in my prejudice I viewed what happened to myself in the light of my own ideas of the traditionary conduct of her advocates and instruments. I was very stern in the case of any interference in our Oxford matters on the part of charitable Catholics, and of any attempt to do me good personally. There was nothing, indeed, at the time more likely to throw me back. "Why do you meddle? Why cannot you let me alone? You can do me no good. You know nothing on earth about me. You may actually do me harm. I am in better hands than yours. I know my own sincerity of purpose, and I am determined upon taking my time." Since I have been a Catholic, people have sometimes accused me of backwardness in making converts, and Protestants have argued from it that I have no great eagerness to do so. It would be against my nature to act otherwise than I do, but besides, it would be to forget the lessons which I gained in the experience of my own history in the past. This is the account which I have to give of some savage and ungrateful words in the British Critic of 1840 against the controversialists of Rome. "By their fruits ye shall know them." We see it attempting to gain converts among us by unreal representations of its doctrines, plausible statements, bold assertions, appeals to the weakness of human nature, to our fancies, our eccentricities, our fears, our frivolities, our false philosophies. We see its agents smiling and nodding, and ducking to attract attention, as gipsies make up to truant boys, holding out tales for the nursery, and pretty pictures, and gilt gingerbread, and physic concealed in jam, and sugar plums for good children. Who can but feel shame when the religion of Ximenes, Borromeo, and Pascal is so overlaid? Who can but feel sorrow when its devout and earnest defenders so mistake its genius and its capabilities? We Englishmen like manliness, openness, consistency, truth. Rome will never gain on us till she learns these virtues and uses them, and then she may gain on us, but it will be by ceasing to be what we now mean by Rome, by having a right, not to have dominion over our faith, but to gain and possess our affections in the bonds of the Gospel. Till she ceases to be what she practically is, a union is impossible between her and England. But if she does reform, and who can presume to say that so large a part of Christendom never can, then it will be our Church's duty at once to join in communion with the continental Churches, whatever politicians at home may say to it, and whatever steps the civil powers may take in consequence. And though we may not live to see that day, at least we are bound to pray for it. We are bound to pray for our brethren, that they and we may be led together into a pure light of the Gospel, and be one as we once were one. It was most touching news to be told, as we were lately, that Christians on the Continent were praying together for the spiritual well-being of England. May they gain light while they aim at unity, and grow in faith while they manifest their love. We too have our duties to them, not of reviling, not of slandering, not of hating, though political interests require it, but the duty of loving brethren still more abundantly in spirit, whose faces, for our sins and their sins, we are not allowed to see in the flesh. No one ought to indulge in insinuations. It certainly diminishes my right to complain of slander uttered against myself, when, as in this passage, I had already spoken in disparagement of the controversialists of that religious body to which I myself now belong. I have thus put together as well as I can what has to be said about my general state of mind for the autumn of 1839 to the summer of 1841. And having done so, I go on to narrate how my new misgivings affected my conduct in my relations towards the Anglican Church. When I got back to Oxford in October 1839, after the visits which I had been paying, it so happened there had been in my absence occurrences of an awkward character, compromising me both with my Bishop and also with the authorities of the University, and this drew my attention at once to the state of the Movement party there, and made me very anxious for the future. In the spring of the year, as has been seen in the articles analyzed above, I had spoken of the excesses which were to be found among persons commonly included in it. At that time I thought little of such evil; but the new views which had come on me during the long vacation, on the one hand made me comprehend it, and on the other took away my power of effectively meeting it. A firm and powerful control was necessary to keep men straight. I never had a strong wrist, but at the very time when it was most needed, the reins had broken in my hands. With an anxious presentiment on my mind of the upshot of the whole inquiry, which it was almost impossible for me to conceal from men who saw me day by day, who heard my familiar conversations, who came perhaps for the express purpose of pumping me, and having a categorical yes or no to their questions, how could I expect to say anything about my actual, positive, present beliefs, which would be sustaining or consoling to such persons as were haunted already by doubts of their own? Nay, how could I, with satisfaction to myself, analyze my own mind, and say what I held and what I did not hold? Or how could I say with what limitations, shades of difference, or degrees of belief, I still held that body of Anglican opinions which I had openly professed and taught? How could I deny or assert this point or that, without injustice to the new light in which the whole evidence for those old opinions presented itself to my mind? However, I had to do what I could, and what was best under the circumstances. I found a general talk on the subject of the Article in the Dublin Review, and, if it had affected me, it was not wonderful that it affected others also. As to myself, I felt no kind of certainty that the argument in it was conclusive. Taking it at the worst, granting that the Anglican Church had not the note of Catholicity, yet there were many notes of the Church. Some belonged to one age or place, some to another. Bellarmine had reckoned temporal prosperity among the notes of the Church, but the Roman Church had not any great popularity, wealth, glory, power, or prospects in the 19th century. It was not at all certain as yet, even that we had not the note of Catholicity; but if not this, we had others. My first business then was to examine the questions carefully, and see whether a great deal could not be said after all for the Anglican Church, in spite of its acknowledged shortcomings. This I did in an Article on the Catholicity of the English Church, which appeared in the British Critic of January 1840. As to my personal distress on the point, I think it had gone by February 21st in that year, for I wrote then to Mr. Bowden about the important Article in the Dublin. Thus it made a great impression here, Oxford, and, I say what of course I would only say to such as yourself, it made me for a while very uncomfortable in my own mind. The great suspiciousness of his argument is one of the things which have made me despond so much, that is, as anticipating its effect upon others. But, secondly, the great stumbling block lay in the 39 Articles. It was urged that here was a positive note against Anglicanism. Anglicanism claimed to hold that the Church of England was nothing else than a continuation in this country, (as the Church of Rome might be in France or Spain), of that one Church of which in old times Athanasius and Augustine were members. But, if so, the doctrine must be the same. The doctrine of the old Church must live and speak in Anglican formularies, in the 39 Articles. Did it? Yes, it did. That is what I maintained. It did in substance, in a true sense. Man had done his worst to disfigure, to mutilate the old Catholic truth, but there it was, in spite of them, in the Articles still. It was there, but this must be shown. It was a matter of life and death to us to show it. And I believe that it could be shown. I consider that those grounds of justification, which I gave above, when I was speaking of Tract 90, were sufficient for the purpose, and therefore I set about showing it at once. This was in March 1840, when I went up to Littlemore; and, as it was a matter of life and death with us, all risks must be run to show it. When the attempt was actually made, I had got reconciled to the prospect of it, and had no apprehensions as to the experiment. But in 1840, while my purpose was honest, and my grounds of reason satisfactory, I did nevertheless recognize that I was engaged in an experimentum crucis. I have no doubt that then I acknowledged to myself that it would be a trial of the Anglican Church, which it had never undergone before; not that the Catholic sense of the Articles had not been held, or at least suffered, by their framers and promulgators; not that it was not implied in the teaching of Andrewes or Beveridge, but that it had never been publicly recognized, while the interpretation of the day was Protestant and exclusive. I observed also that though my Tract was an experiment, it was, as I said at the time, no feeler. The event showed this; for, when my principle was not granted, I did not draw back, but gave up. I would not hold office in a Church which would not allow my sense of the Articles. My tone was, "This is necessary for us, and have it we must and will; and, if it tends to bring men to look less bitterly on the Church of Rome, so much the better." This then was the second work to which I set myself; though, when I got to Littlemore, other things interfered to prevent my accomplishing it at the moment. I had in mind to remove all such obstacles as lay in the way of holding the Apostolic and Catholic character of the Anglican teaching; to assert the right of all who chose, to say in the face of day, "Our Church teaches the primitive ancient faith." I did not conceal this. In Tract 90 it is put forward as the first principle of all. It is a duty which we owe both to the Catholic Church and to our own, to take our Reformed Confessions in the most Catholic sense they will admit. We have no duties towards their framers. And still more pointedly in my letter, explanatory of the Tract, addressed to Dr. Jelf, I say, "The only peculiarity of the view I advocate, if I must so call it, is this, that whereas it is usual at this day to make the particular belief of their writers their true interpretation, I would make the belief of the Catholic Church such. That is, as it is often said that infants are regenerated in baptism, not on the faith of their parents, but of the Church, so in like manner I would say that the Articles are received, not in the sense of their framers, but (as far as the wording will admit, or any ambiguity require it) in the one Catholic sense. A third measure, which I distinctly contemplated, was the resignation of St. Mary's, whatever became of the question of 39 Articles; and, as a first step, I meditated a retirement to Littlemore. Littlemore was an integral part of St. Mary's Parish, and between 2 and 3 miles distant from Oxford. I had built a church there several years before, and I went there to pass the Lent of 1840, and gave myself up to teaching in the parish school, and practising the choir. At the same time I had a view of monastic house there. I bought 10 acres of ground, and began planting; but this great design was never carried out. I mention it, because it shows how little I had really the idea at the time of ever leaving the Anglican Church. That I contemplated as early as 1839 the further step of giving up St. Mary's, appears from a letter which I wrote in October, 1840, to Mr. Keble, the friend whom it was most natural for me to consult on such a point. It ran as follows: "For a year past a feeling has been growing on me that I ought to give up St. Mary's, but I am no fit judge in the matter. I cannot ascertain accurately my own impressions and convictions, which are the basis of the difficulty; and though you cannot of course do this for me, yet you may help me generally, and perhaps supersede the necessity of my going by them at all. First, it is certain that I do not know my Oxford parishioners. I am not conscious of influencing them, and certainly I have no insight into their spiritual state. I have no personal, no pastoral acquaintance with them. To very few have I any opportunity of saying a religious word. Whatever influence I exert on them is precisely that which I may be exerting on persons out of my parish. In my excuse I am accustomed to say to myself that I am not adapted to get on with them, while others are. On the other hand, I am conscious that by means of my position at St. Mary's, I do exert a considerable influence on the University, whether on undergraduates or graduates. It seems then on the whole that I am using St. Mary's to the neglect of its direct duties, for objects not belonging to it. I am converting a parochial charge into a sort of University office. I think I may say truly that I have begun scarcely any plan but for the sake of my parish, but every one has turned independently of me into the direction of the University. I began Saints' Day services, daily services, and lectures in Adam de Broom's chapel for my parishioners, but they have not come to them. In consequence, I dropped the last mentioned, having, while it lasted, been naturally led to direct it to the instruction of those who did come, instead of those who did not. The weekly communion, I believed, I did begin for the sake of the University. Added to this, the authorities of the University, the appointed guardians of those who form great part of the attendance on my sermons, have shown a dislike of my preaching. One dissuades men from coming. The late Vice-Chancellor threatens to take his own children away from the Church, and the present, having an opportunity last spring of preaching in my parish pulpit, gets up and preaches against doctrine with which I am in good measure identified. No plainer proof can be given of the feeling in these quarters than the absurd myth, now a second time put forward, that Vice-Chancellors cannot be got to take the office on account of Puseyism. But further than this, I cannot disguise from myself that my preaching is not calculated to defend that system of religion which has been received for 300 years, and of which the heads of house are the legitimate maintainers in this place. They exclude me, as far as may be, from the University pulpit, and though I never have preached strong doctrines in it, they do so rightly, so far as this, that they understand that my sermons are calculated to undermine things established. I cannot disguise from myself that they are. No one will deny that most of my sermons are on moral subjects, not doctrinal. Still I am leading my hearers to the Primitive Church, if you will, but not to the Church of England. Now, ought one to be disgusting the minds of young men with the received religion, in the exercise of a sacred office, yet without commission, and against the wish of their guides and governors? But this is not all. I fear I must allow that whether I will or no, I am deposing them towards Rome. First, because Rome is the only representative of the Primitive Church besides ourselves. In proportion then as they are loosened from the one, they will go to the other. Next, because many doctrines which I have held have far greater, or their only scope in the Roman system. And moreover, if, as is not unlikely, we have in process of time heretical bishops or teachers among us, an evil which ipso facto infects the whole community to which they belong, and if again, what there are at this moment symptoms of, there be a movement in the English Roman Catholics to break the alliance of O'Connell and of Exeter Hall, strong temptations will be placed in the way of individuals already imbued with a tone of thought congenial to Rome, to join her communion. People tell me, on the other hand, that I am, whether by sermons or otherwise, exerting at St. Mary's a beneficial influence on our prospective clergy. But what if I take to myself the credit of seeing further than they, and of having in the course of the last year discovered that what they approve so much is very likely to end in Romanism? The arguments which I have published against Romanism seem to myself as cogent as ever, but men go by their sympathies, not by arguments. And if I feel the force of this influence myself, who bow to the arguments, why may not others still more, who never have in the same degree admitted the arguments? Nor can I counteract the danger by preaching or writing against Rome. I seemed to myself almost to have shot my last arrow in the article on English Catholicity. It must be added that the very circumstance that I have committed myself against Rome has the effect of setting to sleep people suspicious about me, which is painful now that I begin to have suspicions about myself. I mentioned my general difficulty to Rogers a year since, than whom I know no one of a more fine and accurate conscience, and it was his spontaneous idea that I should give up St. Mary's, if my feelings continue. I mentioned it again to him lately, and he did not reverse his opinion, only expressed great reluctance to believe it must be so. Mr. Keble's judgment was in favour of my retaining my living, at least for the present. What weighed with me most was his saying, "You must consider whether your retiring either from the pastoral care only, or from writing and printing and editing in the cause, would not be a sort of scandalous thing, unless it were done very warily. It would be said, you see he can go on no longer with the Church of England, except in mere lay communion; or people might say you repented on the cause altogether. Till you see your way to mitigation, if not remove this evil, I certainly should advise you to stay." I answered as follows: "Since you think I may go on, it seems to follow that, under the circumstances, I ought to do so. There are plenty of reasons for it, directly it is allowed to be lawful. The following considerations have much reconciled my feelings to your conclusion. 1. I do not think that we have yet made fair trial how much the English Church will bear. I know it is a hazardous experiment, like proving cannon. Yet we must not take it for granted that the metal will burst in operation. It has borne at various times, not to say at this time, a great infusion of Catholic truth without damage. As to the result, namely, whether the process will not approximate the whole English Church, as a body, to Rome, that is nothing to us. For what we know, it may be the providential means of uniting the whole Church in one, without fresh schismatizing or use of private judgment." Here I observe that what was contemplated was the bursting of the Catholicity of the Anglican Church, that is, my subjective idea of that Church. Its bursting would not hurt her with the world, but would be a discovery that she was purely and essentially Protestant, and would be really the hoisting of the engineer with his own petard; and this was the result. I continue. 2. Say that I move sympathies for Rome. In the same sense does Hooker, Taylor, Bull, etc. Their arguments may be against Rome, but the sympathies they raise must be towards Rome, so far as Rome maintains truth which our Church does not teach or enforce. Thus it is a question of degree between our divines and me. I may, if so be, go further. I may raise sympathies more, but I am urging minds in the same direction as they do. I am doing just the very thing which all our doctors have ever been doing. In short, would not Hooker, if Vicar of St. Mary's, be in my difficulty? Here it may be objected that Hooker could preach against Rome, and I could not; but I doubt whether he could have preached effectively against transubstantiation better than I, though neither he nor I held that doctrine. 3. Rationalism is the great evil of the day. May not I consider my post at St. Mary's as a place of protest against it? I am more certain that the Protestant spirit which I oppose leads to infidelity, than that which I recommend leads to Rome. Who knows what the state of the University may be as regards divinity professors in a few years hence? Anyhow, a great battle may be coming on, of which Newman's book is a sort of earnest. The whole of our day may be a battle with the Spirit. May we not leave to another age its own evil, to settle the question of Romanism? I may add that from this time I had a curate at St. Mary's, who gradually took more and more of my work. Also, this same year, 1840, I made arrangements for giving up the British Critic, in the following July, which were carried into effect at that date.